Okay, hi everyone. Hope you're having a good morning so far. I definitely enjoyed my little breathing exercise earlier. So I'm a visual designer, well, for the last 2 years, and I'm slowly transitioning into a customer experience service design space. But my interest in accessibility came about because I was a visual designer for so long. And I slowly learned so much about how technology and the internet and the web has always been an enabler for people living with disabilities. But it's only as good as the experience that lies behind it, because the tools are all there, but just having a checklist of things that work doesn't necessarily mean that something is accessible. And so, so today we're just going to be talking about perspective, because there's so many things out there that can help us to design better experiences for everybody if we just switch the way that we think. So my journey started about 2 years ago when I was designing a spend analytics tool, and the whole point was to read card data of how our customers are spending and compare the information against our competitors, just to see how we're doing. And for a visual designer, that's something that's extremely exciting because it's information design. It's a combination of really technical things, but then there's also an aspect of creation and creativity. I was very excited about creating a new color palette for one, because it was just fresh and new projects. I was like, yay, go. So I thought it would be easy. I would pick one color, pick another color, and then I would end up with an entire palette of colors that I could use. And I thought I was good to go, but not quite. So a lady that I was working with at the time came to me and said, these are really nice colors, but have you ever considered that if someone saw color differently, they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between us and them? And to be honest, I've always known that people are different and that abilities are different, but I never appreciated it up until the point that it was affecting my work. And so I started doing a little bit more research and realized that if someone had low vision, they would just see a blur of colors, and my yellows and greens and blues would just start looking like fewer colors. If they were using old technology, an old monitor, I work at a corporate bank, and our monitors are like those square monitors with really poor displays. If they were looking at it from that, then they wouldn't be able to see a lot of the colors that I'd chosen. And if they were looking at this through a different pair of eyes, then this is what they would see. So protanopia is one of the most common types of color blindness, and it affects mainly men. And a lot of the people that I was designing for that were working in these places that were going to be using this tool were men that were over the age of 40. And so I was sitting there and looking at my colors, a whole spectrum reduced to about 4 colors with different ranges, and that wasn't that great. And so I realized that I was designing and creating in my own Umwelt. Now, Umwelt is a German word that describes a self-centered world. And what it really means is that two organisms, two people, two anything can exist in the exact same environment, but have completely different experiences. And I first learned about this word when I was watching a gentleman called David Eagleman. I really enjoy watching him. He's a neuroscientist, and he spoke about a dog and how you can be sitting there next to your dog, and your dog can look up at you and say, but this human has such a small nose, how do they even survive? How do you not know that your cat was sitting here a minute ago, or that your neighbor is about to knock on your door? How do you experience the world without knowing these things? And that really paints a different picture of how we need different cues in order to consume things that are around us, and to consume the stimuli around us for it to be translated properly. And so at that point, I started to explore more about what it meant to have a disability. And there's so many definitions on the web, and they range from being very negative, things like defect, to being very positive and altruistic, but not really reflecting the true experience of somebody. And the one that I've really landed on that I appreciate a lot more is that to have a disability is to have a negative interaction between a person or a thing and their environment. And so with that understanding, it means that anyone can be disabled in any situation. And so I went forward, and what I wanted to know was, how could I tell the same story to someone who was using a different set of cues to view my information? And then I learned about the different types of disabilities and how what I thought a disability was doesn't necessarily reflect the true nature of what it is. I discovered in visible and visible disabilities that someone who is dyslexic, for example, may not look disabled, but when I'm designing an interface, and I don't consider that person in something like banking, for example, or tasks that are very core to your day-to-day functioning, that becomes a very key thing to think about when you're designing. And so in design, we work a lot with personas, and I'm sure in the product development space, we've all come across different types of personas. And in my space, for example, again, in corporate, it's very hard to get a hold of the people that we're designing for because they're corporate clients, they don't have time for us, they're really hard to access. And so in the end, we end up having what we think are our personas, and we work with a sum of personas up until the end. But what assuming does means that you're working off of your own biases, but also off of your own understanding of the world and that of your team. And unless you have someone in your team that's able to remind you that there's another person living a different kind of experience who will be using said app or website, then you're going to continue and think your personas are great because, I don't know, like, people have reached a certain level of maturity with a lot of the things that they use. But when you dig deeper and start considering people with different abilities, then you can ask yourself questions like, what are their restrictions? How do they use my app? What kind of technology do they use? And then you can also start to think about their spectrum. Now, a spectrum is something that comes from the Microsoft Inclusive Toolkit, which is a really good resource if you want to learn more about accessible design and inclusive design. And it talks about how everyone's abilities exist in a spectrum. So for example, if you're designing for this guy, Peter, and say Peter has a muscular degenerative disease, and so maybe he also has like a bit of a spastic arm and he struggles to use devices because he's got a tremor. You could potentially solve for him, but then in solving for him, you're potentially solving for a new parent who has a contextual disability because maybe they're always walking around with a child in their arm and they're using one hand to do a lot of things. If someone breaks their arm and it's their dominant arm, you're potentially solving for them as well because in that moment, they're disabled. They have a negative interaction between whatever is displayed to them and themselves. And then another thing is old age. As we age, medicine has gotten better and better and better. We live longer. But that doesn't mean that we don't suffer from things that come with old age. Eyesight, arthritis, and a lot of other things that affect the way that we interact with technology. And if anything else doesn't push us to design better, I think the one thing we can think of is the things that I'm designing today with my team, how will they serve me in 20 years' time? How will they serve everyone else who I'm designing for in 20 years' time, considering we're becoming more and more dependent on said technology? And so after all of this, I concluded that disability is contextual. If you walked into a room full of people that are deaf and they're having a conversation and you have no tools to communicate with them, in that situation, you're the one who's disabled. You're the one sitting there with a disability, but you're not born with it. It's more of how you interact in that environment. So how many people are we talking about here? The current world population is sitting at just over 7.6 billion, and 10% of this is made up of people that are disabled. So if you take the United States of America multiplied by 3 and then add Colombia, that's a whole lot of people living with disabilities. And if we think back to our 80-20 rule and the way that we sometimes apply it, and we think of disabled people, or people with disabilities as fringe cases. There are only 1 or 2 using my app, so it's fine. They'll find a way to get by. If you think about it like that, but then you ignore the fact that there are so many people living with disabilities, then you're losing an entire market of people that could be using your app. But not just that, people that could be benefiting and being empowered by the things that you're designing. And 80% of this number is found in developing countries, including South Africa. So ignoring this number is not a really great idea. But also, if you consider that you may not hear a lot of complaints coming out of the community, maybe blind people or deaf people, and you think they're fine. But that's not really a reflection of reality. Or you may look at your metrics and say, well, we only have 4% of users using their app, and they haven't complained, so we should be doing okay. That's not a true reflection of what's happening, because those are almost vanity metrics. If you don't go in and find out why they're only 4%, are they really 4%, how are they using it today, you may discover that they may not be happy with your service, but they're finding ways around it. A lot of people that are blind have assistants that help them. But if you think about it in like a banking sense, for example, you're giving your PIN away to someone to assist you. And if that person's not around and you're defrauded by someone else, the bank's not going to give you your money back because you gave your PIN away willingly. So it's things like that that you consider the ecosystem and the way that someone experiences your device or your app or whatever it is that you're creating. And you start to find holes in the things that you've done, because it doesn't end at just a screen. We're creating experiences for people to live their lives in a different way. And so with nearly 1 billion people living with disabilities, that's more than 1 million reasons for accessible design. Now, there are a few principles out there that help design more accessible platforms, more accessible websites and apps. And one of the leading guidelines is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. And this is like an entire checklist of things. It's a huge checklist, and it's very overwhelming if you don't dissect it and apply it to what you're doing and make it contextually relevant. But a few of them, I'm going to point out 4 principles, and these are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And I'm going to go through them in a little more detail, but a thing to note is that web accessibility is not just about people living with disabilities. It's more about creating better experiences for more people in more environments. Considering, for example, if you went outside right now and you needed to send a text message or make a quick call or order an Uber, and you're looking at your screen and you're like constantly trying to cover it because you can't see anything. If someone had used a checklist of how to make something accessible, you wouldn't be in that situation, because you'd have proper contrast to allow you to consume the information that's on your screen. So as you're creating products, you ask yourself, is it perceivable? And this refers to if someone who is blind, has low vision, is deaf, is using your platform, are they still able to use it? Are there alternatives for them to access that information? So a blind user on a cell phone, for example, would be using screen reading software where it will talk back to them. But if that's not coded correctly, then all they're going to get is a whole lot of gibberish and have to make out things on their way. They'll get to a button, and the button will be labeled button, and they're like, okay, I don't know what this means. And then you ask yourself, is it operable? If someone is using a keyboard to access your website and they don't have a mouse, or maybe they do have a mouse, but the cursor of the mouse is too small for them to see, are they able to tab through using a keyboard? Does your platform allow for that to happen? And this happens more often than we think. If you design for enterprise software, you produce things that are used by big companies or corporations, you may find that sometimes the technology is really behind and they do rely on a keyboard, not because of anything other than it's just taking long to get there, there's too much red tape, or whatever the case is. Then you'll find that someone will use the keyboard. If someone hurts their arm or they have arthritis, they may find that it's easier to use a keyboard than to move around with the mouse, because that's causing a lot of strain on their hand. And then you ask yourself, is it understandable? Now, just because something is perceivable and just because it's operable doesn't mean it's understandable. Is whatever you're doing clear to understand? Does the language make sense? Oftentimes, we do this thing where we get into a place and we learn the language, we learn the lay of the land, and then we forget that we're creating things for people that haven't gone through the same process, and they have to learn these things from scratch. So, and I keep talking about banking because I work in that environment, but in a mobile banking app, or maybe you're sending money overseas, and you have beneficiary versus recipient, and then you have things like remittance versus gift, and someone just wants to send money to somebody else. Like, why not use language that says exactly what it is and make it clear what will happen when they take a specific action? That's what understandable refers to. Is it clear? Is it concise? Do I know what's going to happen when I act? And then you ask yourself, is it robust? So is it compatible with different technologies? You can't support everything. You can't go like way back if it's, I mean, sometimes it doesn't make sense. But that said, if someone is using an old browser, are you supporting it? And if some things aren't available on the latest, on the older browser, then what are you doing to compensate for the people that don't have that technology in order to see what you've created? And in sort of software and hardware development, they call a lot of this, and you may be familiar with it, progressive enhancement, where I may have a particular phone that's slightly older, and I can do all the key things. I'll have the little delightful moments while I'm interacting. And as I get, you know, a smarter upgrade or a smarter phone, then I can do more things. But it doesn't exclude me from doing the core thing that I went there to do. And so in your teams, what can be done today? The example on the left is a screen where there's very low contrast. Now, you may work in teams where designers will come and show you these beautiful things and like examples of, this is what I've created and this is what I think it will look like, and it looks like an amazing shot from a portfolio site. But if you look at it, you can't even see where the input field is. And on the right-hand side is also not that clear here, but ironically, yeah. But having better contrast and not trying to make something very pretty and just making it functional makes a big difference, because at the end of the day, forms in this example are one of the biggest obstacles when someone is doing something. Their goal is maybe to apply for a home loan. Their goal is not to use a form. And so if that form is hard to use, they could just drop off or find something else to do that's better. Or even worse, they could drag you in front of their friends and so on social media and, you know, really bring down the morale of the team that's working on this stuff. Then the second one is color. And I did mention that below is a website that you can access just to check the contrast levels of the colors that you use. The next one is color. Relying on color alone is never a good idea, because, you know, like my exercise earlier with the analytics tool, like relying on color to convey meaning can be detrimental. So on the left-hand side, you've got a green box that signifies a successful completion of a field. Then you've got an error field. But if someone was colorblind, they would see those as two different shades of brown, or maybe the same shade of brown, depending on the monitor that they're using. And so that defeats the entire purpose of you using the colors in the first place. And so a simple thing like adding iconography to help amplify the meaning makes a big difference. And also having hint text at the bottom to explain exactly what's going wrong, alongside, you know, information on how to fix the error. And immediately, even if someone is colorblind or has low vision, you know, having a tick and a cross and a little bit of text to support that already starts to say the same thing in different ways. Another thing is tab order. If someone is using a keyboard, like I mentioned earlier, they're going to be tabbing through your website. Now, if the tab order is messed up, they will start on your menu, and then they could end up maybe on Learn More, and then they'll go back up to Search, and you don't want that. And so a lot of this stuff begins in design, but it's implemented in development. And so there are a lot of people that need to come to the party in order to make this happen. But just being aware of the things that can happen makes such a huge difference in the way that the team is happy to contribute and make this, this change happen. And then the last one in here is labeling. Now, I mentioned labeling a bit earlier when I spoke about a button, just saying button. But if you consider online shopping, for example, and you've got different colors of things, you don't want it to say image 001, sneaker Adidas 44, because to someone who's using a screen reader, they don't know what that is. So you need to have something that's very clear. It can say pink sneaker or pink Adidas sneaker. When they select another color, you say blue Adidas sneaker. It just has to be very clear throughout what you're doing. instead of just having a heart icon, for example, you say add to wish list because that's what you want them to do. You don't want them to hit like because they're not liking it, they're adding it to a wish list. Things like go back home, a lot of the times when a designer hands over files, it just says arrow back or chevron back, forward, whatever it is. And that doesn't really mean too much. Yes, someone can make it make sense for them, but you're giving them extra work where it could be avoided. And so at this point, with all the principles and the guidelines, it's important to remember that it's possible for something to be accessible but not necessarily usable. And by saying that, I mean, you can check all the lists that you want. But if you don't put it in front of people and just test it yourself if you can't get a hold of people, then you may have something that passes an accessibility test, but in practice, it doesn't actually mean anything. And so there's this really nice quote. I think you always have to have a quote in a presentation. There's a really nice quote that I came across that says that in theory, there's no difference between theory and practice, but in practice there is. And you really see that a lot when, if anyone's ever been a part of user testing or seen a user testing report, a lot of things that you assume from the beginning are sometimes completely off. And that's because people find their own happy path in life. There's this really interesting book called Evil by Design, and it just talks about design through the lens of the 7 deadly sins. And it's really interesting, but there's this one bit that talks about a happy path. And at a university, they had this landscaping company come in and do up all the grounds, put these lovely pathways with lights. And then students started just crossing along where they wanted to, and then they created a little path. But instead of working against that, what they did was they made a path out of the path that the students had created because they had found an easier and faster way to get from one building to another building. And those are the things that user testing reveals, right? You think it's going to work one way, and your users show you that your thing could work in a completely different way. So recently, about a month and a half ago, I hosted a workshop in conjunction with a group called Ladies at UX and Standard Bank. And we took the Standard Bank app and we invited a whole lot of people with different types of disabilities, mainly from Blind Association South Africa. We worked with them, and we also worked with the National Council for People with Disabilities. It was really difficult because they've been trying for a really long time to get banks to be more accessible. And so for them to play ball and actually come in and expect something to come out of it, it was a really hard sell because they've been through this dance many times. But we got a few people in there, and it was amazing. We also had some people from Standard Bank, and we also had the lady that heads up the design team at Standard Bank. And they were extremely shocked at how people were struggling to just log into the app using screen reader. Now, something like that would never have come out in a normal user test because you would never have had anyone who was blind using the app that you could observe and ask questions about how they're engaging and how they're finding their way around it. A lot of them were very frustrated, and they brought in notes. I mean, the lady in the bottom left corner, she came in with like a 6-page document with just bullet points of things that were wrong with the app that she had sent through multiple times and no one had responded to. But to see that firsthand made such a big difference. And about 3 weeks or less later, so we sent all the feedback with the Standard Bank team. 3 weeks later, they had implemented a lot of the feedback that they'd gotten from the session into the app. And that was a really special thing because them realizing that it was possible was the first step. All they had to do was change their perspective and learn and figure out how to do these things. And only after Tracy, who heads up the team, went back and gave them this feedback, did they realize that a lot of the team developers already had the skills that were needed to make things more accessible. They didn't have to hire new people, they didn't have to train new people. I mean, you would have to read a tutorial here and there, but it wasn't starting from scratch. It was just a matter of prioritizing and bringing it into the flow. And so you may ask, where does accessibility fit into the existing design process? You're already working, you may have already deployed things. You're running full steam ahead. And the answer is it fits in everywhere. You can't just have it as a last thing at the end, because then you're never going to get to it. It's just going to sit in your backlog forever because it's a nice to have. But if you really think about it, how can something that is inaccessible, maybe say like a banking app, same example again, how can it be acceptable to have an inaccessible banking app when people need to bank? And there's a lot of drive by a lot of people these days, different companies, towards self-service. If you promote self-service and you have a lot of people that can actually access that self-service, you're still going to have people calling into call centers, you're still going to have people going into branch, because you haven't made the core thing that you're trying to sell work for different people in different environments. And so your stakeholders need to be keen. When that strategy is formed in the beginning, they need to play ball and be like, this is part of our KPIs, and we need it to be accessible, and at least check 4 lists. Create your own checklist that makes sense for what you're doing, not just a checklist for the sake of it. Your tech teams need to be involved. They need to tell you what's going to work, how it's going to work. And when you're in the research stage, explore things that are being done elsewhere that you could incorporate. I mean, things like APIs are becoming more and more prevalent. We're seeing a lot more of it, and I think it's in Europe somewhere, and don't quote me on this, where it's now lawful to like open up your APIs to people. And when that comes here, that's going to be so amazing for people to leverage off of and work with. And so imagine the possibilities of not just, and again I'm talking in a bank context, but of not relying on your existing technology stack, but being able to leverage off of other technologies that exist out there. But you'll only know that if you do your research and find out what's out in the market and what's being used. And so accessible design, once you've done all of that, should be there when you need it and invisible when you don't. And it's like a lobby boy. So it's not extra work. It is extra because you're not currently doing it. But once it gets into the flow, it's not extra work. It's not taking away from what you already do. It's enhancing things. And it's not just for a small group of people. It's for everyone. And the lobby boy from the Grand Budapest Hotel is described as invisible but always in sight. So as an example, a lot of people don't know that if you pull out your iPhone straight from the box, a person who is blind can unbox and use their iPhone without help from anyone. And that's a feature that exists on every single device, most devices that we use today. Whether it's Android, whether it's an iOS device, Windows, they all come kitted with accessibility features. But we don't use them because we don't need them. But they don't bother us either. They're on our phones. Like if you pull out your phone today, turn on VoiceOver, it's there. But you will never know that it's there, and but it's there for someone who needs it. So there are a lot of lobby boys in real life, and I've come to see Siri and things like home automation in a different light. I used to think that they were just gimmicks and like ways for companies to just sell their devices. I remember when the Mac got an update and Siri came onto the desktop, I was like, I don't know what these people are trying to do, but who's going to be using Siri on their computer unless it's for fun? And then I came across a series of videos that Apple did, because surprisingly enough, a lot of the stuff that they do when it comes to voice assistants is optimized for people that are living with disabilities, but then it filters down to us, and we enjoy it. So I just want to play this video.
This is a station rock you, shock you, move you, head goofy, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My name is Patrick Lafayette. What do you ever forget? It's because it's radio. Patrick is
She tunes into our settlement here, like a volcano featuring Patrick Lafayette.
to do something for yourself.
Voiceover on launch progress.
It's one of the greatest things you could ever do.
Report. Many 10 items. Counted. Submit. Metro set. Check 1. Allowed request to check 1.
You navigate to the logic recording session.
Now, I can express
He
myself.
uses Tap-Tap-C on his iPhone.
Matrix in progress. Enter 26.
So I really like that video because it's one of the first ones that started taking me a little more out of my own umwelt and my own experience, and showed me just how much more is possible with technology. They've got an amazing series of videos, and some of them, you know, they range from having someone who's using, so they've got a smart home and they go through their door, and before he approaches, this guy's in a wheelchair and he's able to open the door, switch on the lights, do very basic things that would otherwise need someone else to help him. But things like that are very empowering, and you know, when we move beyond seeing technology as just functional and seeing it as empowering, then I think a lot of amazing things can start to happen. A few examples from our daily lives, the curb. A curb was designed initially for people that use wheelchairs. But now when you go to an airport and you have your luggage, or you're coming from a shopping trip, you know, that's one of the first things you look for so that you can get your trolley down. You look for a curb. It wasn't made for us, but it works for us. And autocomplete. Autocomplete is another thing that was initially created for people that have dexterity issues, to just reduce the number of keystrokes that they need to complete a word or a sentence. And it's something that has filtered down into our everyday life. We use it every single day when we're searching, when we're texting, whatever it is we're doing, autocomplete is there for us. And so inclusion inspires innovation. It doesn't make things boring. It doesn't take away from the delight. It doesn't necessarily expand and make your timelines longer for producing something if it's baked in. Because if you're going to design a component and make sure that it's tested for accessibility, once it goes in, it's going in with everything else. If you try and chunk it and say we're going to do accessibility at the end, then your team's going to sit there looking at each other saying, okay, we're going to need 4 weeks, we're going to need 5 weeks to do everything. But if you do it as you design, and some of the 4 things that I showed you earlier with the color and the contrast and the tab order and the labeling, those are things that can be designed once someone is actually creating a static screen, and by the time they get handed over to a developer, it's all been baked in. And yes, it is easier said than done, and I think every team will have to find their own flow and rhythm and what works for them in their environment, but it's definitely not impossible. I'm going to close off with one story. I tell this story all the time, but it's because I really like it. I met this gentleman online, which sounds strange, but it wasn't strange. He's a blind man, but I didn't know this when we were conversing. So we were just chatting via email, and we're talking about how to make banking more accessible. And he used to work as a developer. He initially studied law, and then he went into development, and he used to develop for ABSA, way back when. And so then we decided to meet. So I went over to his house, and I remember when I got there, I was so surprised that he was blind, because up until that moment, I had no idea. There's nothing in the email that gave it away. Things that are probably dumb that I assume, but there weren't any errors, everything was, right, he responded in time. All my assumptions were starting to be watered down. And so he introduced me to his wife, who was also blind. And I was like, okay. So then I sat down, and she offered some tea. I'd gone with a friend of mine. She offered to make us some tea. We said, thank you, we would like that. And then I expected someone to be given an instruction to make us some tea. And no one was given that instruction. So she went about her house, and she moved in and out of the kitchen. She went to the server to get her nice teacups and her sauces. Everything was matching. She made the tea, and then she laid it on the table. And I was so surprised, because I was like, in my world, you need a working pair of eyes to boil hot water and not get burned, and make people a cup of tea and present it in such a beautiful way where everything is matching and everything is in the right place. I was really surprised, but then I took a step back and I thought, I'm probably putting myself back in my umwelt, right? I'm using my own cues and the things that I know how to use and pull on in order to decipher and complete a task. But I'm completely ignoring the fact that she's been living this way for a very long time, and she's gotten used to the way things are done. She knew where everything was, she knew where the doors were, she knew how high the counters were. And all of that got me thinking that maybe this is what products need to become. maybe we need to find a way as people that make things to make our products feel more like home. And that's me.